my mother, my older brother, my aunt and her 2 daughters, my uncle who never learned my name but always remembered to ask me for gas money. They all sat in that living room, like they had every right to be there, and I guess they did, because it was their house as it had never really been mine. I was 22 when I figured that out. The house was in Dayton, Ohio. Not the part people mention when they talk about Dayton, but the east side, where the Dollar General on the corner had been robbed twice in one summer, and nobody was surprised either time. We rented from my uncle's friend, which meant the heat went out every January, and we were not allowed to complain about it. 4 of us lived there at different points. Sometimes 5, when my cousin's boyfriend needed a place. The couch in the basement had a permanent impression in the middle cushion, and I knew every spring that had come loose underneath it, because I slept on that couch for almost 2 years. I want to be clear about something before I tell you the rest of this. I am not someone who grew up hating her family. I spent most of my childhood actually trying very hard to be what they needed. I cooked. I cleaned. I translated at the pharmacy when my grandmother's English got lost in the middle of a sentence. I stayed home from prom to babysit my cousin's kids, because my cousin had a date and I did not feel like I was allowed to say no. I paid the electric bill in March of 2014, with money I had saved from shelving groceries at a store, 2 bus rides away. I paid it and told my mother it was handled, and she nodded and went back to her show, and did not ask me how I had come up with it. That is the part that took me the longest to understand. Not the taking, the not asking. I had been accepted to a nursing program at a state school in Columbus. The acceptance letter came to our mailbox on a Tuesday, and I carried it inside and sat with it for about 4 minutes before I showed anyone. I think part of me already knew what was coming. I showed my mother first. She looked at it for a long moment and said, "That is far." I said, "It is 90 minutes. She said, "Who is going to be here?" Not congratulations. Not I'm proud of you. Who is going to be here? My brother found out that same evening and his first question was about my financial aid package. He wanted to know how much I was getting. He asked it the same way he might ask what was for dinner. Casually, like it was information that belonged to him by default. I told him I had gotten a partial scholarship and some grants and that I was going to apply for work study on campus. He said, "So you'll have extra?" I said, "I don't know yet, I just found out today." He said, "Because I'm trying to get the car fixed." The car was his car. I did not own a car. I had never owned a car. I had taken the bus to work for 3 years to save the money that I had used to pay the electric bill and the internet bill and the copay for my grandmother's blood pressure medication. And my brother was asking me about my financial aid refund check so he could fix his car. I did not say any of that. I said, "Let me see how the first semester goes." He said, "You always do this." I said, "Do what?" He said, "Act like you're better than us, just because you got into some school." I had not acted like anything. I had been standing in the kitchen in my socks holding an acceptance letter I had been waiting for since November. But I had learned a long time ago that pointing out what I had not done was not the same as winning an argument in that house. So I folded the letter back into the envelope and I went to the basement, and I sat on the couch with the broken spring and I thought, I am going to go. I am going to go and I am going to figure the rest out when I get there. My grandmother was the only one who said anything close to what I needed to hear. She was 71 and had bad knees and a very small bedroom at the end of the hall. And she had been slipping me $20 bills on my birthday since I was 14, always from the same blue coin purse she kept in the drawer next to her bed. When I told her about Columbus, she reached over and held my hand and said, "Good, just that good." And then she said, "You take everything you have and you go." I said, "What if they need me here?" She said, "They will always need something. That is not the same as needing you." I have thought about that sentence every single day for the last 7 years. I left in August. I packed what fit in 2 bags, and a plastic bin I bought at Walmart for $8. My mother did not come outside when the rideshare pulled up. My brother was not home. My aunt hugged me in the doorway and said to call when I landed, which was a strange thing to say since I was driving, not flying, but I understood what she meant, and I said I would. My grandmother stood on the porch. She had a card in her hand. She gave it to me and told me not to open it until I got there. Inside was $360, everything in the coin purse, I think, and a note in her handwriting that said, "You were always the strong one." I did not know it then. I know it now. I cried for most of I-70 East, not because I was sad, exactly, though I was that too. I cried because it was the first time in my adult life that I had done something entirely for myself, and I did not have any practice at how that felt. Columbus was hard in the ways I expected, and hard in ways I did not. The dorm room was tiny, and I had a roommate from a suburb outside Cleveland, who had a mini fridge full of Locra, and parents, who called her every Sunday. I did not resent her for any of it. I just noticed it, the way you notice things when you do not have them yourself. I worked 12 hours a week through work study, and picked up weekend shifts at a coffee shop near campus, and I did not have much money, but I had enough. And enough felt enormous to me at the time. I called home for the first few months. My mother and I talked on the phone every Sunday, for about the first 8 weeks, and then the calls got shorter. And then they became texts. And then, around October, my brother called me to tell me that he had looked into it, and my financial aid refund was supposed to be deposited directly to me, and that he needed $400 to cover what he owed his friend for the car work. I said, I don't have $400. He said, you got a refund check. I said, I used it for books and my portion of utilities. He said, you have one set of bills. We have a whole house. I said, that is not my house anymore. He was quiet for a second and then he said something I have not repeated to many people. He said, you were never really part of this family anyway. You always thought you were different. He said it like it was an insult. He did not understand that to me at that point it felt like being handed a permission slip. I did not hang up on him. I finished the call. I said, I hope the car gets fixed. And then I put my phone face down on my desk. And I sat there in the quiet of my dorm room, and I made a decision. I was not going to be available anymore. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened next, because I have heard people use the phrase, went no contact, and make it sound like a dramatic gesture, like slamming a door. It was not like that for me. It was more like quietly closing a window. I had been leaving open for years in case someone needed air. I stopped answering calls. I stopped responding to texts. I did not block anyone because I did not want to make it a confrontation. I just let the silence grow until it was the size of a room, and then the size of a house, and eventually it was just the size of my life. And I got used to living in it. I finished the nursing program in 3.5 years. I passed my boards on the first attempt. I got a job at a mid-sized hospital in Columbus and then, 2 years later, a better one in Indianapolis. I had an apartment with central air and a kitchen that got actual sunlight in the mornings, and a savings account that I checked every month, and felt something I can only describe as physical relief when I saw the number. I had a life, a real one, that I had built from the $360 my grandmother tucked into a card, and the broke spring in a basement couch, and the 2 bus rides to a grocery store I shelved for 3 years before any of this became possible. I did not talk about my family to most people I knew. When coworkers asked about holidays, I said my family was complicated, and most of them understood that to mean something specific, without me having to explain it. I had friends. I had a person I was seeing for a while, and then wasn't, and then someone new who I liked better and who asked good questions and did not push. When I said some things were still being processed, I was okay. I was more than okay, most of the time. I was living in a way I had not known was available to me. 7 years passed. I did not count them while they were happening. I counted them later, when I had reason to. The reason came on a Wednesday's night in early March. I had just finished a 12-hour shift. I had driven home and changed out of my scrubs and heated up leftover soup, and sat down on my couch, the real couch, the one I had chosen myself from a furniture store and paid for in full, and I looked at my phone. 23 missed calls. They had come in over the course of about 5 hours, starting at 6 in the evening. My mother, my brother, my aunt. 2 numbers I did not recognize. My cousin, my mother again, my uncle, my mother 3 more times, and then a voicemail notification, and then another, and another. By the time I had scrolled to the bottom of the screen, there were 19 voicemails. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long moment and I thought about what my grandmother had said. They will always need something. That is not the same as needing you. I did not listen to the voicemails that night. I put my phone on the charger, and I finished my soup and I washed the bowl and I went to bed. I stared at the ceiling for a while. I was not angry, which surprised me a little. I was not sad either. I was something harder to name. Something in the range of tired, but also aware that the tiredness was almost over. Like I could feel the shape of a decision coming before I had made it yet. I found out the next morning what the calls were about. My grandmother was in the hospital. She had fallen in the hallway outside her room and broken her hip, and the surgery had complications, and she was in the ICU and had been asking for me. She had been asking for me. I called the hospital directly. The nurse I spoke with was kind, and gave me what information she could, and told me that my grandmother had been moved out of the ICU overnight and was stable. I sat on the edge of my bed and breathed for a minute. Then I listened to the voicemails. My mother's first one was calm. She said, "Grandmother fell and I need you to call me back." Her second one had more urgency. By the 5th one she was crying and asking where I was. My brother's voicemail was not as gentle. He said something about how this was exactly what he had always said, that I cared more about my own life than my own blood. My aunt said, "Please, just call someone back. We are all scared." My cousin said, "Grandma keeps saying your name." I called my mother back. She answered on the second ring. For a moment neither of us said anything. Then she said, "You didn't pick up." I said, "I was working a 12-hour shift and I came home and went to sleep." She said, "We didn't know where you were." I said, "I have been in Indianapolis for 2 years. The number is the same." She did not have a response to that. I told her I would drive down that weekend. She said, "Can you come sooner?" I said, I have to arrange coverage for my shifts, she said. She's been asking for you. I said I know. I heard the voicemails. I will come Saturday. She asked if I was angry. I thought about it. I said, I'm not angry. I'm not really anything right now. I just need a few days, she said. I said yes. She was quiet and then she said, okay. I drove to Dayton on Saturday morning. 4 hours because of construction on 70. I had a coffee in a travel mug and I listened to a podcast about deep sea ecosystems for the first hour. And then I turned it off and just drove in the quiet. The hospital was 15 minutes from the house I grew up in. I went there first, before I went to see anyone else. I found her room. She was smaller than I remembered people getting smaller when you haven't seen them. She had an IV in her arm and a bruise along her left cheekbone from the fall, and she was asleep when I came in. I sat in the chair next to her bed and I waited. She woke up, about 20 minutes later. She looked at me and she did not seem surprised. She just said, there you are, I said, here I am. She said, I knew you'd come. I said, of course I came. She reached over and found my hand the same way she always had and she held it and she said, how are you doing really? Not how is your job or did you drive safely? How are you doing really? I said, I'm okay. Better than okay most of the time. She said, good. I worked for that. She smiled when she said it. We sat together for almost 2 hours. She slept on and off and I stayed. I did not look at my phone. I did not think about the voicemails or the 5 years of silence or what was waiting for me in the next building. I just sat with her and held her hand and let it be simple. My mother came in around noon. She stopped in the doorway when she saw me. She had aged in ways I had not been there to watch happen gradually, so it hit me all at once. The gray at her temples, the way she held her shoulders. She said my name. I stood up. We hugged. It was not a comfortable hug. It was the hug of two people who had not practiced it in a long time. But we held on. My brother came later. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at me, and I looked at him and he said, you look good. I said thanks. He said I'm glad you came. I said me too. We did not talk about the phone call from 7 years ago. I did not bring it up. He did not bring it up. I am not sure whether that was grace or avoidance, but it did not feel like the right moment to find out. My aunt made dinner that night at the house. My uncle was there. My cousins. There were people I did not know well, and people I did not know at all. I sat at the table and ate the food and answered questions about my job and my apartment, and said yes, Indianapolis is a good city, and no, I don't miss the snow the same way as here, and yes, I am happy. That last one surprised me when I said it, because it was true. After dinner my mother and I sat on the back porch. It was cold but not unbearable. She had a blanket over her shoulders. We sat in the dark for a while and then she said, I didn't know it was that bad. I said. She said, for you, here. I didn't know it was that hard for you. I wanted to say a lot of things. I wanted to say, you could have asked. I wanted to say, I paid the electric bill when I was 19, and you did not ask me how. I wanted to say that I slept on a couch, with a broken spring for 2 years and nobody offered me the bedroom. But I looked at her and she was 70 years old and tired in a way I recognized and I thought, what does it cost me to let her mean what she's saying? I said, it's okay. She said, is it? I said, it will be. She reached over and put her hand on my arm. She said, I am proud of you. I don't think I said it enough when I should have. I don't think I said it at all. I did not cry. I had cried on I-70 7 years ago, and I think I had used a certain amount of crying up. But something in my chest moved, something settled. I drove back to Indianapolis on Sunday evening. The traffic was lighter. I had the podcast on again for a while, and then I turned it off again and drove in the quiet. When I got home, I sat in my car in the parking garage for a few minutes before I went inside. I thought about my grandmother asking for me by name. I thought about my mother on the porch with the blanket over her shoulders. I thought about my brother saying I look good, with no other agenda behind it. At least not one I could see. I thought about the 23 missed calls, and the 19 voicemails, and the 5 hours they had spent trying to find me on a Wednesday night. I thought about who I was when I left, and who I was now, and how much of that distance I had made alone. Here is what I have come to understand about forgiveness. And I want to be precise about this because I think the word gets used wrong a lot. It is not the same as trust. Forgiving someone does not mean you are reopening every door you closed. It means you are choosing not to carry the weight of what they did into every room you walk into. It means you are putting it down. Not because they deserve that. Because you do. I am still working on that. I will probably always be working on it. But I drove back to Dayton 2 weeks later to see my grandmother in the rehab facility, where she was learning to walk again with a new hip. I brought her a puzzle. She always liked puzzles, the kind with small pieces and a lot of sky. She was already better. More herself. She looked at the puzzle and said, 900 pieces. I said, you have time. She said, so do you. She is right. I have time. That is the part they do not tell you about leaving, that it is not actually the end of anything, even when it feels like it. It is just the beginning of a version of your life, where you are finally a person and not just a function. I still have the card she gave me the day I drove away. $360 and a note in her handwriting. I keep it in my nightstand. I do not look at it often, but I know it is there, and knowing it is there is enough.